The Venus of Azombeii by Clark Ashton Smith. The statuette was not more than 12 inches in height and represented a female figure that somehow reminded me of the Medicean Venus, despite many differences of feature and proportion. It was wrought of a black wood, almost as heavy as marble, and the unknown artist had certainly made the most of his material to suggest the admixture of a negroid strain with a type of beauty well-nigh classic in its perfection of line. It stood on a pedestal formed in imitation of a half-moon, with the cloven side of the hemisphere constituting the base. On studying it more closely, I found that the resemblance to the Venus de Medici was largely in the pose and in the curves of the hips and shoulders, but the right hand was more elevated than hers in its position, and seemed to caress the polished abdomen, and the face was fuller, with a smile of enigmatic voluptuousness about the heavy lips, and a sensuous droop of the deep eyelids, which were like the petals of some exotic flower when they fold beneath a sultry velvet evening. The workmanship was quite amazing, and would not have been unworthy of the more archaic and primitive periods of Roman art. My friend Marsden had brought the figurine with him on his return from Africa, and it stood always on his library table. It had fascinated me, and had stirred my curiosity from the first. But Marsden was singularly reticent concerning it, and beyond telling me that it was of Negro workmanship, and represented the goddess of a little-known tribe on the upper Benue in Adamawa, he had so far declined to gratify my inquisitiveness. But his very reserve, and something of significant import, even of emotional perturbation in his tone whenever he spoke of the statuette, has made me believe that a story hung thereon. And knowing Marsden as I did, remembering his habitual reticence recurrently varied by outbursts of a well-nigh garrulous confidentiality, I felt sure that he would tell me the story in due time. I had known Marsden ever since our school days, for we had both been in the same year at Berkeley. He possessed few friends, and none, perhaps, who had been intimate with him as long as I. So no one was better fitted than I to perceive the inexplicable change that had come over him since his 2 years of traveling in Africa. This change was both physical and spiritual, and some of its features were of so subtle a character that one could hardly give them a name or seize upon them with any degree of clearness. Others, though, were all too plainly marked. The increase of Marsden's natural melancholia, turning now into fits of ferocious depression, and the woeful deterioration of his health, never too robust even in its prime, would have been noticeable to the merest acquaintance. I remembered him being very tall and wiry, with a sallow complexion, black hair, and eyes of a clear azure blue. But since his return, he was far thinner than of old, and he stooped so much that he gave the impression of having actually lost in height. His features were shrunken and wrinkled. His skin had become corpse-like in its pallor. His hair was heavily sprinkled with gray, and his eyes had darkened in an unaccountable manner, as if they had somehow absorbed the mysteriously profound and sinister blue of tropic nights. In them there burned a fire they had never before possessed, a macabre fire such as one would find in the eyes of a man consumed by some equatorial fever. Indeed, it often occurred to me that the readiest explanation of the change in Marsden was that he had been seized by some lethal sickness of the jungle, from which he had not yet fully recovered. But this he had always denied when I questioned him. The more elusive alterations at which I have hinted were mainly mental, and I shall not try to define all of them. But one in particular was quite signal. Marsden had always been a man of undoubted courage and hardihood, with nerves that were unshakable in spite of his melancholic disposition. But now I perceived in him, at times, a queer furtiveness, an undefined apprehensiveness quite at variance with his former character. Even in the midst of some trivial or commonplace conversation, a look of manifest fear would suddenly pass over his face. He would scrutinize the shadows of the room with an apprehensive stare, and would stop halfway in a sentence, apparently forgetting what he had started to say. Then, in a few moments, he would recover himself and go on with the interrupted speech. He had developed some odd mannerisms, too. One of them was that he could never enter or leave a room without looking behind him, with the air of a man who fears that he is being followed, or that some imminent doom is dogging his every footstep. But all this, of course, could have been explained as nervousness attendant upon or resulting from the illness that I suspected. Marsden himself would never discuss the matter, so after a few discreet suggestions that might have led him to unbosom himself, if he so wished, I had tacitly ignored the visible changes in his manner and personality. But I sensed a real and perhaps tragic mystery, and felt also that the black figurine on Marsden's table was in some way connected with it. He had told me much concerning his trip to Africa, which had been undertaken because of a lifelong fascination which that continent had held for him. But I knew intuitively that much more was being kept back. One morning, about 6 weeks after Marsden's return, I called to see him, following several days of absence during which I had been extremely busy. He was living alone with one servant in the large house on Russian Hill, San Francisco, which he had inherited together with a considerable fortune from his parents, who were long dead. He did not come to answer my knock, as was his wont, and if my hearing were not exceptionally keen, I do not think I should have heard the feeble voice in which he called out, telling me to enter. Pushing open the door, I went through the hall into the library, from which his voice had issued, and found him lying on a sofa near the table on which stood the black statuette. It was obvious to me, at a glance, that he was very ill. His thinness and pallor had increased to a shocking degree in the few days since I had seen him last, and I was immediately impressed by the singular fact that he had even shrunken more in stature than could be explained by the crouch of his shoulders. Everything about him had shriveled and actually withered as if a flame were consuming him, and the form on the couch was that of a smaller man than my friend. He had aged also, and his hair had taken on a new hoariness, as if white ashes had fallen upon it. His eyes were pitifully sunken, and they burned as embers burn in deep caverns. I could scarcely repress a cry of astonishment and consternation when I saw him. "Well, Holly," he greeted me, "I guess my days are numbered. I knew the thing would get me in time. I knew it when I left the shores of the Benue with that image of the goddess Wana-Os for a keepsake. There are dreadful things in Africa, Holly. Malignant lust and corruption and poison and sorcery. Things that are deadlier than death itself. At least, deadlier than death in any form that we know. Don't ever go there, if you have any care for the safety of body and soul." I tried to reassure him, without paying ostensible heed to the more cryptic references, the more oracular hints of his utterance. "There is some low African fever in your system," I said. "You should see a doctor. Should, in fact, have seen one weeks or months ago. There's no reason why you shouldn't get rid of the trouble, whatever it is, now that you are back in America. But of course you need expert medical attention. You can't afford to neglect anything so insidious and obscure." Marsden smiled, if the ghastly contortion of his lips could be called a smile. "It's no use, old man. I know my malady better than any doctor could know it. Of course, it may be that I have a little fever. That wouldn't be surprising. But the fever isn't one that has ever been classified in medical lore, and there's no cure for it in any pharmacopoeia." With the last word, his countenance assumed a horrible grimace of pain, and seemed to shrivel before me like a sheet of paper that turns ashen with fire. He no longer appeared to notice my presence, and began to mutter brokenly, in tones of a peculiar huskiness, in a harsh, grating whisper, as if the very chords of his throat were involved in the same shrinking that affected his face. I caught most, if not all, of the words. "She is dying too, as I am, even though she is a living goddess. My Benuwe, why did you drink the palm wine? You too will shrivel up and suffer these gnawing, clawing tortures. Your beautiful body, how perfect, how magnificent it was! You will shrivel up in a few weeks, like a little old woman. You will suffer the torments of hellfire. My Benuwe, my Benuwe." His speech became an indistinct moaning, in which portions of words were now and then audible. He had all the aspect of a dying man. His whole body seemed to contract, as if all the muscles, all the nerves, even the very bones, were dwindling in size, or tightening to a locked rigidity, and his lips were drawn in a horrible rictus, showing a thin white line of teeth. I ran to Marsden's living room, where I knew that a decanter full of old Scotch usually stood on the sideboard, and filled a sherry glass with the liquor. Hastening back, I succeeded, though with extreme difficulty, in forcing some of the strong spirit between his teeth. The effect was almost immediate. He revived into full consciousness, his facial muscles relaxed, and he no longer wore the look of tetanic agony that had possessed his whole body. "I'm sorry to have been such a bother," he said, "but the crisis is past, for today. Tomorrow, though, that will be another matter." He shuddered, and his eyes were dark with the haunting of some incombatible horror. I made him drink the remainder of the whiskey, and going to the telephone, took the liberty of summoning a doctor whose abilities were personally known to both of us. My friend smiled a little in grateful recognition of my solicitude, but shook his head. "The end won't be so very far off now," he said. "I know the symptoms. It's a matter of a fortnight, or a little more, when matters reach the point that they have reached today." "But what is it?" I cried. The query was prompted by horror and solicitude more than curiosity. "You will learn soon enough," he replied, pointing to the library table with the forefinger of skeleton thinness. "Do you see that manuscript?" Following his direction, I perceived on the table, close to the wooden statuette, a pile of written sheets which, in my natural concern regarding Marsden's illness, I had not before noticed. "You are my oldest friend," he went on, "and I have been aware for quite a while past that I owe you an explanation of certain things that have puzzled you. But the matters involved are so strange and so peculiarly intimate that I have been unable to bring myself to a frank confession face to face. So I have written for you a full narration of the final 2 months of my stay in Africa, concerning which I have spoken so little heretofore. You are to take it home with you when you leave, but I must beg you not to read the manuscript until after my death. I am sure I can trust you to respect my wishes in this regard. When you read it, you will learn the cause of my illness, and the story of the black figurine, which has tantalized your curiosity so much." A few minutes later, there came a knock on the door, and I went to answer it. As I expected, it was Dr. Felton, who lived only a few blocks away, and who had left home immediately in reply to my summons. He was a brisk and confident type of person, with the air of habitual reassurance, of professional good cheer, that goes so far in building up a doctor's reputation for proficiency. But I could see beneath his manner an undertone of doubt, of real bafflement, as he examined Marsden. "I'm not altogether sure what is wrong," he admitted, "but I think the trouble is mainly digestive and nervous. Doubtless the African climate and the food must have upset you quite radically. You will need a nurse if there is any recurrence of the attack you have had today." He wrote a prescription and left shortly after. Since I had a pressing engagement, I was obliged to follow him in about half an hour, taking with me the manuscript that Marsden had indicated. But before going, I called the nurse by telephone, with Marsden's authority, and left her in charge, promising to return as soon as possible. Of the fortnight that followed, with the frightful protracted agonies, the brief and illusory shifts for the better, and ghastly relapses that characterized my friend's condition, I cannot bear to write a full account. I spent with him all the time I could spare, for my presence seemed to comfort him a little, except during the awful daily crises when he was beyond all consciousness of his surroundings. Toward the last, there were lengthening intervals of delirium, when he muttered wildly, or screamed aloud in terror of things or persons visible only to himself. To be with him, to watch him, was an ordeal without parallel, and to me the most dreadful thing about it all was the progressive shriveling, the perpetual diminution of Marsden's head and body, and the lessening of his very stature, which went on hour by hour and day by day, with paroxysmal accompaniments of a suffering not to be borne by human flesh without lapsing into madness or oblivion. But I cannot enter into details or describe the final stages, and I hardly dare even hint the condition in which he died and in which his body went to the undertaker. I can only say that in their extreme, their more than infantile dwarfage and devolution of form, the remains bore no likeness to anything that it would be permissible to name. Also, that the task of the undertaker and the pallbearers was phenomenally light. When the end came, I gave thanks to God for the belated mercy of my friend's death. I was completely worn out, and it was not until after the funeral that I summoned enough energy and resolution for a perusal of Marsden's manuscript. The account was clearly written in a fine feline script, though the handwriting bore evidence of stress and agitation toward the end. I transcribe the narrative hereunder with no liberties of abridgment or amplification. I, Julius Marsden, have experienced all my life the ineffable nostalgia of the far-off and the unknown. I have loved the very names of remote places, of Antipodean seas and continents and isles, but I have never found in any other word even a tithe of the untellable charm that has lain inherent for me ever since childhood in the 3 syllables of the word Africa. They have conjured up for me, as by some necromantic spell, the very quintessence of all mystery, of all romance, and no woman's name could have been dearer to me, or more eloquent of delight and allure, than the name of this obscure continent. By a happy dispensation, which, alas, does not invariably attend the fulfillment of our dreams, my 22 months of sojourning in Morocco, Tunis, Egypt, Zanzibar, Senegal, Dahomey, and Nigeria had in no way disappointed me, for the reality was astoundingly like my vision. In the hot and heavy azure of the skies, the great levels of desert sand, or of rampant jungles, the long and mighty rivers winding through the landscape of unbelievable diversity, I found something that was deeply congenial to my spirit. It was a realm in which my rarest dreams could dwell and expand with a sense of freedom never achievable elsewhere. At the end of the 22nd month of my sojourn, I was traveling on the upper reaches of the river Benue, that great eastern tributary of the Niger. My immediate objective was Lake Chad, with whose confluent rivers the Benue is connected by means of an upland swamp. I had left Yola with several boatmen of the Fula tribe, a race of Negroid Mohammedans, and we had now rounded the eastern slope of Mount Atlantika, that enormous granite bulk that looms for 9,000 feet from the fertile plains of Adamawa. It was a picturesque and beautiful country through which we were passing. There were occasional villages surrounded by fields of durra, of cotton yams, and great stretches of wild, luxuriant forest, or baobabs, bananas, delib palms, pandanus, and plantains, beyond which arose the castellated tops of ridgy hills and fantastically carven cliffs. Toward sunset, Atlantica had become a bluish blur in the distance, above the green sea of the jungle. As we went onward in our 2 small barges, one of which was mainly laden with my personal effects, I perceived that my boatmen were conversing among themselves in low voices, and caught a frequent repetition of the word Azombeii, always with a note of fear and a warning. I had already picked up a little of the Fula language, and one of the boatmen, a tall, well-featured fellow, bronze rather than black, was master of a sort of broken German, variegated with a few words of English. I questioned him as to the subject and import of the conversation, and learned that Azombeii was the name of the district we were now approaching, which, he declared, was peopled by a pagan tribe of unusual ferocity, who were still suspected of cannibalism and human sacrifice. They had never been properly subdued, either by the Mohammedan conquerors of the country or by the present German administration, and lived very much to themselves in their own primeval way, worshipping a goddess named Wanaos, a goddess unfamiliar to the other pagan tribes of Adamawa, who were all fetishists. They were especially inimical toward the Mohammedan Negroes, and it was perilous to intrude upon their territory, particularly during their annual religious festival now being celebrated. He and his fellows, he confessed, were loath to proceed much farther. On all this, at the time, I made no express comment. To me, the story seemed none too credible, and savored of the ignorant prejudice of insular peoples who are ever suspicious and fearful of those beyond their own borders. But I was a little disturbed, for I did not want the course of my journey to be suspended by any difficulty with my boatmen or the natives. The sun had now gone down with a tropical abruptness, and in the brief twilight I saw that the forest on the river banks had become more dense and exuberant than any through which we had before passed. There were ancient baobabs, enormous in the gloom, and the pendant leaves of mammoth plants fell down to the river like cataracts of emerald. Over all, a primordial silence reigned, a silence fraught with the burden of things unutterable by human speech, with the furtive pulse of an esoteric and exotic life, the secret breathing of unformulable passion, of unapprehended peril, the spirit of a vast and insuppressible fecundity. We landed on a grassy margin, and proceeded to make our camp for the night. After a meal of yams and groundnuts and tinned meat, to which I added a little palm wine, I brought up the matter of continuing our journey on the morrow, but not until I had pledged myself to triple the boatmen's wages would they promise to take me through the Azombeii country. I was more than ever inclined to make light of their fears, and, in fact, had begun to suspect that the whole business was mere play-acting, with no other purpose than the extortion of an increase of pay. But this, of course, I could not prove, and the boatmen were full of an apparent reluctance, vowing by Allah and his Prophet Mohammed that the danger they would incur was incomparably dire, that they, and even myself, might furnish soup meat for the revels of Azombeii, or smoke on a pagan altar before the setting of tomorrow's sun. They also told me some curious details concerning the customs and beliefs of the people of Azombeii. These people, they said, were ruled by a woman who was looked upon as the living representative of the goddess Wanaos, and who shared the divine honors accorded to her. Wanaos, as far as I could gather, appeared to be a goddess of love and procreation, resembling somewhat in her character both the Roman Venus and the Carthaginian Tanit. I was struck even then by a certain etymological similarity between her name and that of Venus, a similarity regarding which I was soon to learn more. She was worshipped, they told me, with rites and ceremonies of an orgiastic license beyond all parallel, a license which shocked even the neighboring pagans, who were themselves given to vile practices not to be tolerated by any virtuous Muslim. They went on to say that the Azombeians were also addicted to sorcery, and that their witch doctors were feared throughout Adamawa. My curiosity was aroused, though I told myself that in all probability the rumors related by the boatmen were fables or gross exaggerations. But I had seen something of Negro religious rites, and was able to credit the tales of orgiastic excess, at any rate. Pondering the strange stories I had heard, my imagination became excited, and I did not fall asleep till after an unwonted interval. My slumber was heavy, and full of troubled dreams that appeared to prolong intolerably the duration of the night. I awoke a little before dawn, when the red horn of a waning moon had begun to set behind the serrate edges of the palm trees in the west. Looking about in the half-light, with eyes that were still bemused with sleep, I found myself entirely alone. The boatmen and their barges were gone, though all of my personal property and some of the provisions had been left behind with an honesty quite scrupulous, considering the circumstances. Evidently, the fears expressed by the Fulas had been genuine, and discretion had overpowered their desire for gain. Somewhat dismayed by the prospect of having to continue my journey alone, if it were to be continued at all, and without means of navigation or conveyance, I stood irresolute on the river bank, as the dawn began to brighten. I did not like the idea of turning back, and since I did not consider it at all probable that I could be in any bodily danger at the hands of the natives in a region under German rule, I finally resolved to go on and try to engage bearers or boatmen in the Azombeii district. It would be necessary for me to leave most of my effects by the river for the present, and return for them later, trusting to find them undisturbed. I had no sooner made up my mind to this course of procedure than I heard a soft rustling in the long grasses behind me. Turning, I perceived that I was no longer alone, though my companions were not the missing Fulas, as I had hoped for a brief instant. 2 Negro women, attired in little more than the lightening amber air of morn, stood close beside me. Both were fairly tall and well proportioned, but it was the foremost of the 2 who caught my attention, with a veritable shock of surprise, not altogether due to the suddenness of her approach. Her appearance would have surprised me anywhere, at any time. Her skin was a lustrous velvet black, with subtle gleams of rapid-running bronze, but all her features and proportions, by some astounding anomaly, were those of an antique Venus. Indeed, I have seldom seen in Caucasian women a more consummate regularity of profile and facial contour. As she stood before me without moving, she might have been a woman of Rome or Pompeii, sculptured in black marble by a statuary of the Latin decadence. She wore a look that was both demure and sensual, an expression full of cryptic poise, allied with great sweetness. Her hair was done in a rich coil on the nape of a comely neck. Between her breasts, on a chain of beaten silver, hung several ruddy garnets, carven with rough intaglios, whose precise nature I did not notice at the time. Her eyes met mine in perfect frankness, and she smiled with an air of naive delight and mischief at my all too obvious dumbfoundment. That smile made me her voluntary captive henceforward. The second woman was of a more negroid type, though personable enough in her way. By her bearing and demeanor, she gave the impression of being somehow subordinate to the first, and I assumed that she was a slave or servant. The one semblance of a garment worn by both was a little square of cloth depending in front from a girdle of palm fiber, but the fabric of the square worn by the first was finer than that of the other, and differed from it in having a fringe of silky tassels. The leader turned and spoke a few words to her companion in mellifluous, liquid tones, and the servant replied in a voice almost equally soft and musical. The word Aromani was repeated several times with accompanying glances at me, and I readily surmised that I was the theme of their conversation. I could not understand their speech, which bore no likeness to the Fula language, and indeed was different from that of any pagan tribe I had so far encountered in Adamawa. But some of the vocables teased me with a vague sense of familiarity, though I could not define or align this familiarity at the moment. I addressed the two women in the scant Fula that I knew, asking if they were of the Azombeii tribe. They smiled and nodded their heads in recognition of the word, and made signs to me that I was to follow them. The sun had now leapt above the horizon, and the forest was filled with a great and golden radiance as the women led me away from the river shore and along a meandering path among gigantic baobabs. They walked before me with a grave and effortless grace, and the leader looked back every now and then over her shapely shoulder, smiling with a complacent curve of the full lips and a delicious droop of the carven lids that had in them a trace of simple coquetry. I followed, half overcome by emotions that were new to me, by the first pulsations of a mounting fever of the senses and the mind, the stirring of unfamiliar curiosities, the subtle languor, the poppy-drowsy delight of the Circean enchantment. I felt as if the immemorial attraction of Africa had suddenly become embodied for me in a human shape. The forest began to thin, and we came to cultivated fields, and then to a large village of clay huts. My sable guides pointed to the village, saying the one word, Azombeii, which, as I learned later, was the name of the principal town, as well as of the district in general. The place was astir with Negroes, many of whom, both male and female, were possessed of a clear-cut type of feature unaccountably reminiscent of the classical, and similar to that of the two women. Their skins varied from the darkest ebony to a sultry, tarnished copper. Many of them were crowded around us immediately, regarding me with a sort of friendly inquisitiveness, and making signs of obeisance and reverence before my Venus-like companion. It was clear that she occupied a place of high importance among them, and I wondered not for the first time if she were the woman of whom the Fulas had spoken, the ruler of the Azombeii and the living vice-regent of the goddess Wanaos. I tried to converse with the natives, but could not make myself understood until an old man with a bald head and a straggling fringe of grey beard came forward and hailed me in broken English. He, it seemed, had travelled as far afield as Nigeria during his youth, which accounted for his linguistic accomplishments. None of the others had ever been more than a few miles beyond the confines of his own territory, and apparently the tribe had little intercourse with outsiders, either Negro or Caucasian. The old man was most affable and loquacious, evidently delighting in an opportunity to air his command of a foreign tongue. It was hardly necessary to question him, for he began at once to volunteer the information which I desired. His people, he announced, were very glad to see me, for they were friendly toward the whites, though they had no manner of use for the Muslim Negroes of Adamawa. Also, he went on, it was manifest that I had won the favor and protection of the goddess Wanaos, since I appeared among them under the guidance of my Benuwe, the beloved ruler, in whom the spirit of the goddess resided. At this, he made a humble obeisance toward my lovely guide, who smiled and addressed a few sentences to him, which he forthwith interpreted, saying that my Benuwe had proffered me an invitation to remain in Azombeii as her guest. I had intended to broach immediately the matter of hiring bearers or engaging boatmen for the continuance of my journey on the Benue, but at this invitation, and the sweet, wistful, almost supplicating look which my Belowe directed upon me as her words were being translated, I forgot all about my plans, and told the interpreter to thank my Belowe and say that I accepted the invitation. A few hours earlier, I should not have dreamt of the possibility of feeling any specific interest in a black woman, since that aspect of the charm of Africa was one which had never really touched me heretofore. But now, the first weavings of an unforeseen magic were upon me. My senses had become preternaturally active, and my normal processes of thought were benumbed as by the working of some insidious opiate. I had been eager to reach Lake Chad, and the idea of tarrying by the way had never before occurred to me. Now, it seemed the most natural thing in the world to remain in Azombeii, and Lake Chad became a dimly receding mirage, far off on the borders of oblivion. My Belowe's face grew radiant as a summer morn when my acceptance was interpreted. She spoke to some of the people about her, obviously giving them instructions. Then she disappeared into the crowd, and the old interpreter, with several others, led me to a hut which they put at my disposal. The hut was quite clean, and the floors were strewn with strips of palm leaf, which exhaled an agreeable odor. Food and wine were set before me, and the old man and 2 girls remained in attendance, saying that they had been appointed as my servants. I had barely finished my meal when some more natives entered, bearing the belongings I had left by the riverside. Now, in reply to my queries, the interpreter, whose name was Nagaza, told me as much as his rudimentary English would convey regarding the history, habits, and religion of the people of Azombeii. According to their traditions, the worship of Wana-Os among them was almost as old as the world itself, and had been introduced ages and ages ago by some white strangers from the north, who called themselves Arumani. These strangers had settled and married among the natives, and their blood had gradually become disseminated throughout the whole tribe, who had always remained apart from the other pagans of Adamawa. All white people were called Arumani by them, and were looked upon with peculiar respect on account of these traditions. Wana-Os, as the Fulas had said, was a deity of love and fecundation, the mother of all life, the mistress of the world, and her image had been accurately graven in wood by the pale strangers, so that the Azombeians might have an exemplar for their idols. It had always been customary to associate a living woman with her worship, as a sort of avatar or embodiment of the goddess, and the most beautiful maiden of the district was chosen by the priests and priestesses for this role, and filled also the office of queen, with the privilege of taking to herself a male consort. My Belowe, a girl of 18, had recently been elected, and the annual festival of Wana-Os, which consisted of liberal drinking and feasting, together with nightly ceremonies of worship, was now in progress. While I listened to the old man, I indulged in certain speculations of a surprising order. I deemed it not impossible that the pale strangers of whom he spoke had been a party of Roman explorers who had crossed the Sahara from Carthage and penetrated the Sudan. This would account for the classical features of my Belowe and others of the Azombeians, and for the name and character of the local goddess. Also, the vague familiarity with some of the words spoken by my Belowe was now explicable, since I realized that these words had borne a partial resemblance to Latin vocables. Much amazed by what I had learned, and by all that I had succeeded in piecing together, I lost myself in odd reveries, while Nagaza continued his babbling. The day wore on, and I did not see my Belowe, as I had fully expected, nor did I receive word from her. I began to wonder a little. Nagaza said that her absence was attributable only to urgent duties. He leered discreetly, as he assured me that I would soon see her again. I went for a walk through the village, accompanied by the interpreter and the girls, who refused to leave me for a moment. The town, as I have said, was large for an African village, and must have comprised 2,000 or 3,000 people. All was neat and orderly, and the general degree of cleanliness was quite remarkable. The Azombeians, I could see, were thrifty and industrious, and gave evidence of many civilized qualities. Toward the hour of sunset, a messenger came, bearing an invitation from my Benuwe, which Nyagaza translated. I was to dine with her in her palace, and then attend the evening rites in the local temple. The palace stood on the very outskirts of the town, among palms and pandanus, and was merely an overgrown hut, as African palaces are wont to be. But the interior proved to be quite comfortable, even luxurious, and a certain barbaric taste had been displayed in its furnishing. There were low couches along the walls, covered with draperies of native weaving, or the skins of the ayu, a sort of freshwater seal found in the Benue. In the center was a long table, not more than a foot in height from the floor, around which the guests were squatted. In one corner, as in a niche, I noticed a small wooden image of a female figure, which I rightly took to be a representation of Wanaos. The figure bore a strange resemblance to the Roman Venus, but I need not describe it further, since you have often seen it on my library table. My Benuwe greeted me with many compliments, which were duly translated by Nyagaza, and I, not to be outdone, replied with speeches of a flowery fervor by no means insincere. My hostess had me seated at her right hand, and the feast began. The guests, I learned, were mostly priests and priestesses of Wanaos. All of them regarded me with friendly smiles, with the exception of one man who wore a murderous frown. This man, Nyagaza told me in a whisper almost inaudible, was the high priest Benuwe, a mighty sorcerer or witch doctor, much feared rather than revered, who had long been in love with my Benuwe, and had hoped to be chosen for her consort. As unobtrusively as I could, I surveyed Benuwe with more attention. He was a muscular brute, over 6 feet in height, and broad without being stout. His face was regular in outline, and would have been handsome were it not for the distortion due to a most malignant expression. Whenever my Benuwe smiled upon me or addressed some remark to me through Nyagaza, his look became a demoniacal glare. I readily perceived that the first day of my visit in Azombeii had brought me a powerful enemy, as well as a possible sweetheart. The table was laden with equatorial delicacies, with the meat of young rhinoceros, several kinds of wild fowl, bananas, papayas, and a sweet, highly intoxicating palm wine. Most of the guests were prone to gorge themselves in true African fashion, but my Benuwe's manner of eating was as dainty as that of any European girl, and she endeared herself to me all the more by her restraint. Benuwe also ate little, but drank immoderately, in a seeming attempt to achieve inebriation as soon as possible. The eating and drinking went on for hours, but I paid less and less attention to it and to my fellow guests, in the ever-growing enchantment of my Benuwe's presence. Her sinuous, youthful grace of figure, her lovely, tender eyes and lips, were far more potent than the wine, and I soon forgot to notice even the baleful glaring of Benuwe. On her part, my Benuwe displayed toward me a frank favor, swiftly conceived and avowed, which she did not even dream of disguising. She and I began to speak a language which did not require the interpretation of old Nyagaza. With the one exception of Benuwe, no one seemed to regard our mutual infatuation with anything but approval. Presently, the time of the evening rites approached, and my Benuwe excused herself, telling me that she would meet me later in the temple. The gathering broke up, and Nyagaza led me through the nocturnal village, where groups of people were feasting and reveling about their fires in the open air. We entered the jungle, which was full of voices and flitting shadowy forms, all on their way to the fane of Wanaos. I had no idea what the temple would be like, though somehow I did not expect the usual African fetish house. To my surprise, it proved to be an enormous cave in a hill back of the village. It was illumined by many torches and had already become crowded with the worshippers. At the farthest end of the huge chamber, whose lofty vault was dark with impenetrable shadow, there stood on a sort of natural dais an image of Vanaos, carved in the customary black wood of a tree that is native to Azombeii. The image was somewhat more than life-size. Beside it, on a wooden seat that could easily have accommodated another person, sat my Benuwe, statuesque and immobile as the goddess herself. Fragrant leaves and grasses were burning on a low altar, and tom-toms were throbbing with delirious insistence, regular as the beating of turgid pulses, in the gloom behind the goddess and her mortal vice-regent. The priests, priestesses, and devotees were all naked, except for little squares of cloth, similar to that worn by my Benuwe, and their bodies gleamed like polished metal in the wildly flickering light of the torches. All were chanting a solemn, monotonous litany, and they swayed in the slow movements of a hieratic dance, lifting their arms toward Vanaos, as if to invoke her favor. There was an undeniable impressiveness about it all, and as if by contagion, a bizarre excitement began to invade me, and something of the sacred fervor felt by the devotees found its way into my own blood. With eyes intent upon my Benuwe, who seemed to be in a veritable trance, unconscious or unheedful of all about her, I felt the resurgence of atavistic impulses, of barbaric passions and superstitions, latent in the subterranean depths of being. I knew the promptings of a savage hysteria, of a lust both animal and religious. The old interpreter, who had disappeared in the throng, returned to my side anon, saying that my Benuwe had requested that I come forward to her seat. How the request had been communicated I cannot imagine, for surely her lips had never opened or moved beneath my intent and passionate watching. The worshippers made way for me, and I stood before her, thrilling almost with a kind of awe, as well as a frenetic desire, when I met her eyes that were filled by the solemn possession of the amorous deity. She motioned me to seat myself beside her. By this act, as I learned later, she selected me before all the world as her consort, and I, by accepting the invitation, became her official lover. Now, as if my enthronement with my Benuwe were a signal, the ceremonies took on a new excitation, with an orgiastic trend at which I can only hint. Things were done at which Tiberius would have blushed. Elephantis itself could have learned more than one secret from the savages. The cavern became a scene of indiscriminate revel, and the goddess and her representative were alike forgotten in the practice of rites that were doubtless appropriate enough, considering the nature of Vanaos, even though they were highly improper from a civilized viewpoint. Through it all, my Benuwe maintained a perfect immobility, with open eyes whose lids were as still as those of the statue. At last she arose and looked around the cavern upon her oblivious devotees, with a gaze that was wholly inscrutable. Then she turned to me, with a demure smile and a slight movement of the hand, and beckoned me to follow her. Unnoticed by anyone, we left the orgies and came forth upon the open jungle, where warm gusts of perfume wandered beneath the tropical stars. From that night there began for me a new life, a life which I will not try to defend, but will only describe as far as any description is possible. I had never before conceived of anything of the sort. I should never have believed myself capable of the sensuous fervor I felt for my Benuwe, and the almost inenarrable experiences into which her love initiated me. The dark, electric vitality of the very earth upon which I trod, the humid warmth of the atmosphere, the life of the swiftly growing luxuriant plants, all became an intimate part of my own entity, were mingled with the ebb and flow of my blood, and I drew nearer than ever before to the secret of the charm that had lured me across the world to that esoteric continent. A powerful fever exalted all my senses. A deep indolence bedrugged my brain. I lived as never before, and never again, to the full capacity of my corporeal being. I knew, as an aborigine knows, the mystic impact of perfume and color and savor and tactual sensation. Through the flesh of my Benuwe, I touched the primal reality of the physical world. I had no longer any thoughts or even dreams in the abstract meaning of such terms, but existed wholly in relation to my surroundings, to the diurnal flux of light and darkness, of sleep and passion, and all sensory impressions. My Benuwe, I am sure, was indeed lovable, and her charm, though highly voluptuous, was not altogether of the body. She had a fresh and naive nature, laughter-loving and kindly, with less of actual or latent cruelty than is common to the African. And always I found in her, even apart from her form and features, a delightful suggestion of the elder pagan world, a hint of the classical woman and the goddess of old myths. Her sorcery, perhaps, was not really complex, but its power was complete, and lay as far beyond analysis as beyond denial. I became the ecstatic slave of a loving and indulgent queen. The flowers of an equatorial spring were now in bloom, and our nights were opiate or aphrodisiac with their fragrance. The nocturnal heavens were full of fervid stars, the moons were balmy and propitious, and the people of Azombeii looked with favor upon our love, since the will of my Benuwe was to them the will of the goddess. One cloud alone, a cloud which we scarcely regarded at first, was visible in our firmament. This cloud was the jealousy and ill will of Mergowi, the high priest of Wanaos. He glowered with a lethal malignity, sullen as a Negro Satan, whenever I happened to meet him. But his ill will was not otherwise demonstrated, either by word or act, and Nagaza and my Benuwe both assured me that overt hostility on his part would be most improbable at any time, since, because of my Benuwe's divine office and my position as her lover, anything of the sort would savor of actual blasphemy. As for me, I felt an intuitive distrust of the sorcerer, though I was far too happy to expend much thought on the problem of his potential maleficence. However, the man was an interesting type, and his reputation was literally something with which to conjure. People believed that he knew the language of animals, and could even hold converse with trees and stones, which accorded him whatever information he might require. He was reputed to be a master of what is known as bad fetish. That is to say, he could lay an evil spell on the person or possessions of whosoever had incurred his enmity. He was a practitioner of involtuation, and was also said to know the secret of a terrible slow poison, which caused its victim to wither up and shrivel to the stature of a newborn child, with prolonged and hellish agonies, a poison which did not begin to operate for weeks or even months after the time of its consumption. The days went by, and I lost all proper count of their passage, reckoning time only by the hours I spent with my Benuwe. The world and its fullness were ours. Ours were the deep blue heavens, and the flowering forest, and the grassy meadows by the riverside. As lovers are prone to do, we found for ourselves more than one favorite haunt, to which we liked to repair at recurrent intervals. One of these haunts was a grotto behind the cave temple of Wanaos, in whose center was a great pool fed by the river Benue through subterranean channels. At some remote time, the roof of the grotto had broken in, leaving a palm-fringed aperture in the hilltop, through which the sunlight or moonlight fell with precipitate rays upon the sombre waters. Around the sides there were many broad ledges and fantastic alcoves of columnar stone. It was a place of weird beauty, and my Benuwe and I had spent more than one moonlit hour on the couch-like shelves above the pool. The waters were inhabited by several crocodiles, but of these we took little heed, absorbed in each other and in the bizarre loveliness of the grotto that always changed with the changing light. One day my Benuwe had been summoned away from the village on some errand whose nature I cannot now remember. Doubtless it concerned some problem of justice or native politics. At any rate, she was not expected back till the following noon. Therefore, I was quite surprised when a messenger came to me at evening, with word that my Benuwe would return sooner than she had planned, and that she had requested me to meet her in the grotto behind the cave of Vanaos at the hour when the rays of the moon, now slightly gibbous, would first fall through the opening above. The native who brought this message was a man I had never seen before, but of this I thought nothing, since he purported to come from the outlying village to which my Benuwe had been called. I reached the cavern at the hour appointed, and paused on the verge of one of the ledges, looking about in the uncertain light for my Benuwe. The moon had begun to pour a fairy radiance over the rough edge of the pit in the cavern dome. I saw a stealthy movement in the waters beneath me, where a crocodile slid through the silver-gleaming ebony of the surface. But of my Benuwe herself I could find no visible sign anywhere. I wondered if she were not hiding from me in some prankish mood, and resolved to make a search of the alcoves and shelves on tiptoe in order to surprise her. I was about to leave the ledge on which I stood when I received a violent push from behind, which precipitated me with a headlong suddenness into the black pool 7 or 8 feet below. The waters were deep, and I sank almost to the bottom before I recovered myself, or even realized what had happened. Then I rose and struck out blindly for the shore, remembering with a thrill of terror the crocodile I had seen a moment before my fall. I reached the edge, where it shelved down with accessible gradations, but the water was still deep, and my fingers slipped on the smooth stone. Behind me I heard the furtive rippling, and knew its causation all too well. Turning my head, I saw 2 of the great saurians, whose eyes burned with unholy phosphorescence in the moonlight as they glided toward me. I think that I must have cried aloud, for, as if in answer, I heard a woman's voice cry out on the ledge above, and then the rippled waters were cleft by a falling form that shone for an instant with a flash as of black marble. A breathless interval while the waters foamed, and then a well-known head arose beside me, and an arm that held aloft a glittering knife. It was my Benuwe herself. With miraculous adroitness, she drove the knife to its hilt in the side of the foremost crocodile, as the monster opened his formidable jaws to seize me. Her stroke found the heart, and the crocodile slipped back beneath the surface, thrashing about in a brief agony. But its companion came on without pausing, and met the same unerring thrust of my Benuwe's knife. There were stirrings in the pool, and the dark bodies of others began to appear. With a superhuman agility, in what was seemingly no more than a single movement, my Benuwe drew herself out on the rocks of the margent, and caught my hands in hers. An instant more, and I stood beside her, hardly knowing how I had come there, so light and swift had been my ascent. The crocodiles were nosing the shore beneath us when I turned to look back. Breathless and dripping, we sat on a moon-bright shelf on the cavern, and began to question each other with tender interludes of silence and caresses. In a few weeks I had learned much of the Azombeii tongue, and we no longer required an interpreter at any time. To my astonishment, my Belowe denied having sent me a messenger that evening. She had returned because of an overwhelming premonition of some imminent evil that menaced me, and had felt herself drawn irresistibly to the grotto, arriving just in time to find me floundering in the pool. While passing through the cave of Vanaos, from which a low tunnel led to the open grotto, she had met a man in the darkness, and thought that it might have been Mergowe. He had passed without speaking, in as much haste as my Belowe herself. I told her of the push I had received from behind as I stood on the ledge. It was all too evident that I had been lured to the cavern by someone who desired to make away with me, and as far as we knew, Mergowe was the one person in Azombeii capable of conceiving or nurturing such a motive. My Belowe became very grave, and little more was said between us regarding the matter. After our return to the village, my Belowe sent several men to search for Mergowe and bring him before her. But the sorcerer had disappeared, and no one could tell his whereabouts, though more than one person had seen him earlier in the evening. He did not return to his dwelling on the morrow, and though a sedulous and thorough quest was instituted throughout the whole of Azombeii, no trace of him could be found during the days following. His very disappearance, of course, was taken for an implicit confession of guilt. Supreme indignation was rife among the people when the episode in the grotto became publicly known, and in spite of the fear his reputation had evoked, Mergowe would have fared disastrously at their hands, and the sentence of death pronounced against him by my Belowe would have been needless if he had dared to show himself among his fellow tribesmen. The unexpected peril I had faced, and the marvelous rescue effected by my Belowe, served to draw us even closer together, and our passion found a new depth and gravity henceforward. But as time went on, and nothing was heard of Mergowe, who seemed to have been swallowed up by the wide and sultry silence of the equatorial spaces, the episode began to recede, and gradually dwindled to our view in a lengthening perspective of blissful days. We ceased to apprehend any further attempt at harm on the part of the witch-doctor, and were lulled to an indolent security, in which our happiness took on the hues of its maturing summer. One night the priests of Wanaos were giving a dinner in my honor. 40 or 50 people were already gathered in a banqueting hall not far from the temple, but my Belowe had not yet arrived. As we sat awaiting her, a man entered, bearing a large calabash full of palm wine. The man was a stranger to me, though he was evidently known to some of the people present, who hailed him by name, calling him Marvasi. Addressing me, Marvasi explained that he had been sent by the people of an outland community with a gift of palm wine, which they hoped that I, as the consort of my Belowe, would deign to accept. I thanked him, and bade him convey my acknowledgement to the donors of the wine. "Will you not taste the wine now?" he said. "I must return immediately, but before leaving, I should like to learn if the gift meets with your approval, so that I can tell my people." I poured out some of the wine into a cup and drank it very slowly, as one does in testing the savor and quality of a beverage. It was quite sweet and heavy, with a peculiar after-flavor of puckerish bitterness, which I did not find altogether agreeable. However, I praised the wine, not wishing to hurt Marvasi's feelings. He grinned with apparent pleasure at my words, and was about to depart when my Belowe entered. She was panting with haste. Her expression was both wild and stern, and her eyes blazed with unnatural fire. Rushing up to me, she snatched the empty wine-cup from my fingers. "You have drunk it!" she cried, in a tone of statement more than of query. "Yes," I replied, in great wonder and perplexity. The look that she turned upon me was indescribable, and full of conflicting elements. Horror, agony, devotion, love, and fury were mingled in it, but I knew somehow that the fury was not directed toward me. For one intense moment, her eyes held mine. Then, averting her face, she pointed to Marvasi and bade the priests of Wanaos to seize and bind him. The command was instantly obeyed, but before offering any explanation, and without saying a word to me or to anyone, my Beloe poured out a cupful of the palm wine and drank it at a single draught. Beginning to suspect the truth, I would have seized it from her hand, but she was too quick for me. "Now we will both die," she said when she had emptied the cup. For a moment her face assumed a tranquil smile. Then it became the countenance of an avenging goddess as she turned her attention to the wretched Marvasi. Everyone present had now surmised the truth, and mutterings of rage and horror were heard on all sides. Marvasi would have been torn limb from limb, joint from joint, muscle from muscle, by the bare hands of the priests, if it had not been for my Beloe, who intervened and told them to wait. Stricken with abject terror, the man cowered among his captors, knowing too well the manner of doom that would be meted out to him in spite of any momentary reprieve. My Beloe began to interrogate him in brief, stern sentences, and Marvasi, whose awe of her was even more patent than his fear of the priests, made answer with many stammerings as he cringed and fawned. He confessed that the wine was poisoned, also that he had been hired by the sorcerer and high priest Mergoui to proffer it to me and see that I drank some of it at once, if possible. Mergoui, he said, had been hiding in the forest on the borders of Azombeii for weeks, living in a secret cavern known only to himself and a few adherents, who had brought him food and such news as he desired to learn. Marvasi, who was under certain intimate obligations to Mergoui, and had been used by him as a tool on other occasions, was one of these adherents. "Where is Mergoui now?" questioned my Beloe. Marvasi would have hesitated, but the eyes of the queen, ablaze with anger and with superhuman mesmerism, dragged the very truth from his reluctant lips. He said that Mergoui was now lurking in the jungle on the outskirts of the town of Azombeii, waiting for assurance that the poison had been drunk by its intended victim. A number of the priests were at once dispatched to find Mergoui. While they were absent, my Beloe told me how warning of the plan to poison me had been brought to her by another of Mergoui's friends, who had recoiled at the final hour from the atrociousness and audacity of such a design. The priests returned in a little while, bringing the captive sorcerer. They had succeeded in coming upon him unaware, and though he struggled with demoniacal strength and fury, they bore him down and bound him with thongs of rhinoceros hide. They brought him into the banqueting hall amid a horror-frozen silence. In spite of his desperate predicament, the face of the sorcerer was full of a malevolent triumph as he stood before us. Proud and superbly erect, he gave no evidence of fear, but his mane proclaimed the satanic possession of an evil exultation. Before my Beloe could question or address him, he began to pour forth a torrent of dreadful mouthings, intermingled with maledictions and vituperations. He told us how he had prepared the poison. He enumerated the fearsome ingredients, the slowly chanted and litiferous ruins, the manifold and mighty power of the baleful fetishes that had gone into or had helped in its making. Then he described the action of the poison, the preliminary months during which my Beloe and I would suffer innumerable pangs, would die uncounted deaths in our anticipation of the deferred agonies to come, and then the interminable tortures themselves. The slow and hideous contraction of all our fibers, all our organs, the drying up of the very sources of life, and the shrinkage to infantile or even pre-infantile stature and dimensions before the relief of death. Forgetful of all but his mad hatred, his insensate jealousy, he lingered over these details. He repeated them again and again, with so vile a gloating, so horrible and rapturous a relish, that a sort of paralyzing spell was laid upon the assembly, and no one stepped forward to silence him with a knife or a spear. At last, while his mouthings continued, my Beloe filled another cup with the poisoned wine, and while the priests held Mergui and forced his teeth apart with their spear blades, she poured the wine down his throat. Oblivious or contemptuous of his doom, he betrayed no slightest quiver or shrinking of fear, but glared with that awful look of exultation all the while, like a black fiend who rejoices over the damned, even though he himself is numbered among them. Marvasi was also compelled to drink the wine, and he cringed and cried with terror, frothing at the mouth when the lethal liquor touched his tongue. Then the two men, by my Beloe's order, were led away and imprisoned, and were left under a strong guard to await the working of the poison. But later in the night, when their deed became known to the populace, a multitude of men and women, maddened beyond all measure or control, broke in and overpowered the guards, and carried Marvasi and Mergui to the grotto behind the cave of Wanaos, where they were flung like offal to the crocodiles in the black pool. Now, for my Beloe and me, there began a life of indepicable horror. Dead was all our former joy and happiness, for the blackness of the doom to come lay on us like the charnel shadow cast by the gathering of myriad vultures. Love, it is true, was still ours, but love that already seemed to have entered the hideous gloom and nothingness of the grave. But of these things I cannot tell you. Though I have told you so much, they were too sacred and too terrible. After the leaden lapse of funereal days, beneath heavens from which for us the very azure had now departed, it was agreed between my Beloe and me that I should leave Azombeii and return to my native land. Neither of us could bear the thought of having to witness day by day the eventual torments and progressive physical disintegration of the other when Mergui's poison began to operate. Of our farewell meeting, I can only say that it was infinitely sorrowful, and that I shall remember the love and grief in my Beloe's eyes amid the culminative pangs and disordered illusions of my last delirium. Before I left, she gave me for a keepsake the little image of Wanaos, concerning which you have asked me so often. It is needless to detail my return to America. Now, after months of a delay that has had in it nothing of mercy or mitigation, I feel the first workings of the poison. I have recognized all its preliminary symptoms, and the sickening expectations of haunted days and sleep-forbidden nights are being realized. And knowing all that is yet to come, and seeing with the clarity of imaginative vision that sears my soul the coincidental agonies of my Beloe, I have begun to envy the death of Marvasi and Mergui in the pool of crocodiles.